Okay, so before we begin, I want to thank you all for coming back to this channel and checking out the content. So as some of you may know, I am running a Minn Kotta Power Drive trolling motor. And through my years of having this motor, I have noticed that it's probably seen better days. I went ahead and ordered a bunch of rebuild parts for this, and I wanted to guide you through the whole process. Now, before we begin on the guiding of the process, let's just cover a couple of things that are good to know about rebuilding this and what it entails. So first things first, you're going to need a 1/2 inch socket to remove the prop. Second, you're going to need a 1/4 inch socket that will also need to take out the end caps. For this, you will also need a needle nose pliers for removing the old brushes. You'll also need some marine grade lubricant, also for the internal nylon and steel washers, some light grade sandpaper, something stern enough to sand off excess crud. You'll also need red thread locker for the shaft, and I think your general standard flathead screwdriver or Phillips possibly for popping off the seals from the center end cap. Alright, let's name off some of the parts. Number 25, the composite tube. Number 5, the Minn Kotta brush end housing. Number 12, the brush plate. Number 13, the spring for the brushes. Number 10, the brushes. Number 17, the torque screws. Number 11, the cardboard seal that sits inside the brush plate. This will contain the ball bearings. Number 2, the bearing itself that connects to the shaft to the armature. This locks. Number 3, the E-clip. Number 20, the 2 nylon washers. Number 19, the 1 steel washer, which will sit on top of the E-clip, and then the 2 nylon washers will go on top. Number 14, the rubber seal between the brush end housing and the center housing. Number 4, the center housing. Number 16, the seal for the Minn Kotta brush end housing to the center housing. Number 6, the end cap housing. Number 8 and 9, 2 internal seals for the end cap housing. Number 18, 2 long bolts, which will have seals at the end of the neck of the screws. Number 29, the 1 locking pin. Number 26, the prop itself. Number 27 and 28, this will be the washer and the bolt. Alright, 27, 28, and 26, we're removing the washer, the bolt, and the prop. This will give us access to the locking pin. We remove that also from the shaft. Make sure you place these somewhere safe. It'll be a pain in the butt if you lose them. Let's access the 2/4 inch bolts. We'll remove these with the seals on the center end cap, and the center housing should now be able to be removed. Gently check it out, and now your armature is exposed. From this point, we can now look at the 12 brush plate access along with the brushes themselves. You can see how worn out these are. I want you to take note on this next section. Watch how much rust and crud comes out on a slow instant replay. Yeah, this is why I had to rebuild this, because I can definitely feel it in the trolling motor whenever the Kayak was engaged for full speed. Here's a view of the center housing. As you can see, it's rusted out, so I went ahead and ordered a replacement for this. In this section here, I'm going to point out the torque screws that I removed. I don't remember the exact size, but you can figure it out. It's the number 17 torque screw. These unfortunately busted on me, but I did have access now to the brush plate to check it thoroughly to make sure it didn't rot out. Also take note to where the positive and negative terminals are. This is crucial for when you reinstall this. Here's one example of the bolts that I pulled off with the torque screw. Unfortunately, these snapped, so I had to order a whole new end housing piece. So in this section, we're going to deal with the composite tube, number 25. This needs to be removed in order to replace the end housing and to replace the composite tube itself. You can remove it by twisting this counterclockwise off. Once you get that off, remove the 4 bolts that hold the head unit. This is going to be the head. You have to uncable these again. You can watch the previous video to see how I did that. Once these are threaded through, you'll have access to finally pull this all the way out. Make sure you pull off any of the additional parts. Once that is set, you can actually unlock the pin and then slowly yank that out. Once you pull that out, just thread the cables through gently. You don't want to make sure you don't mess anything up in that area. Now that you have the composite tube removed, you're going to need to remove the locker piece that's on top of the end housing. You're going to need that for the new one installed. So you can remove that usually with just a Phillips screwdriver. And as you can see, this is pretty beat up, so now I got the new parts ordered. This is the new composite tube ordered from Northland Marine. Now, in order for me to get the correct length, what I did was I put the new composite tube, lined it up to the older one so I can get an accurate measurement. How I did this was, once I had them side by side, I was able to go ahead and mark the new composite tube roughly to get a better idea of where my new marking was. I use a PVC pipe cutter. I highly suggest you don't do this at first, because this is actually, unless you have a really sharp blade, it ends up gumming up most of the blade itself and it's very difficult to get off. The blade needs to be big enough to penetrate the 1/4 inch to maybe 1/8 inch composite tube, and unfortunately this was not strong enough to do the job. I would suggest using a hacksaw. This hacksaw here was clearly strong enough for me to cut through it like butter. Highly suggest that if you get a new one or find an old one that's still sharp. On this next stage, we're going to remove the bearing to the shaft. This is going to remove from the armature. As you can see, you'll need a hammer, a wrench, and a socket. Put a pin under the shaft, that way it knocks right out real easy for the bearing. Also, when doing this, make sure you're doing it on a wooden bottom or platform. It's going to be the same process to get the new bearing on. Make sure it's clean and possibly add some lubricant so it'll go on smoother. Just like this, I added a wooden board at the bottom and actually put a wooden cover on the top. That way to prevent any damage from the hammer hitting the shaft or the bearing. These things are pretty crucial and sensitive, so you don't want to beat them up. This armature here for my trolling motor I actually just refurbished. What I did was remove the old bearing. As you can see, it's rusted and cruded and very rigid. This creates a lot of vibrations in the motors. We definitely don't want that when we're trying to creep up on these bass. As you can see, the commutator was dirty, and in order for me to go ahead and clean that up, I used a little bit of soft sandpaper for the fine grit and just cleaned off all that grit. This is a copper contact, so you want to make sure this is as clean as possible. After sanding most of these elements down and cleaning it up, I now have a clean contact on those copper connections. I even ahead and wiped down the rest of it. In this demonstration here too, what I want to point out is these are the nylon washers and steel washers. You will eventually replace these. That hole right there is where the center pin's going to go, the lock's the problem. But this is just to demonstrate also how bad the old bearing was compared to the new bearing. Here I'm going to demonstrate the old brush plate and the new brush plate. The new brush plate is above, but the old brush plate I'm showing you number 13, the spring for the brushes, and number 10, the brushes themselves. That spring action you see is what pushes the brushes against the commutator. Now take note on how these are installed so that way you know how to put them back on the new setup. As you can see, these springs are set up right there, and the reason I have them like that is that way when I install the new setup and it's already bolted in, all I have to do is push these down like this, and the brushes will engage and lock the commutator along next to the metal brushes. And now we see the view of the brushes. This is the most common worn out element of most trolling motors. As you can see, the bottom is the old worn out brushes and the top are the new ones. Here is a view again of the brush plate itself. With this, we're going to be looking at the number 11, the cardboard container. That cardboard container will sit inside the brush plate. The purpose of this is when that bearing is spinning, it doesn't rub away on the plastic and wear out the brush plate itself. In this section here, we're installing the brush plates into the brush panel. Make sure these beveled edges are aligned with the spring clip itself. In this area here, now you'll see that the brush is actually installed, and now we have to just connect the final piece inside the brush plate. This is what it should look like once it's fully put back together. As you can see, the locking pins are not engaged. Okay, in this section we're going to look at the end cap housing. Those two center seals you're going to want to remove with the flat head. And when you replace them, take note on how exactly they came out because you'll be using number 8 and 9 for the center seals. This is number 3, the E-clip. This will fall on the shaft. You will remove the old E-clip and replace it with a new one. On top of that E-clip, you're going to put the steel washer, number 19, and the 2 nylon washers. And here we have the 2 brush plates. I have the old one and the new one side by side for comparison. If you look on the old brush plate, you'll see that it is marked with a white dot. That white dot represents the positive cable. You want to do the same type of marking on the new brush plate also. Here, just as an example, I point to that with the white marking. That will be the positive terminal. You will connect the positive cable toward that. There's actually a marking on these two on the bottom right hand corner, and it's identical for both. And I believe that marking there is actually to determine to where the positive connection would go. Please take note of this so that way you do not invert the cable connection. Now we're at number 25, the composite tube. This composite tube has to be threaded into the end cap brush housing. Now I suggest you use red thread locker 271, let it sit out for at least 8 hours, and then once you're done, drill that hole onto the composite tube so that way your head unit could be placed in, and you run the cables through it too also. In this footage here, we're now looking at the brush plate with the cardboard container and the new brushes, with the torque screws and the spring load actions already set up and ready to receive the new armature. As you can see here, I did not fully engage the clips, the retainer clips, onto the brushes. The reason is I wanted to allow the armature to slide in easier. Once the armature is in, I would push the clips down and they'd be able to engage and hold on to the armature. It's a little tricky to do this, but don't forget. On this next category, what we're going to look at is the brush housing seal. This is number 16 for the housing. And here we have a side-by-side comparison. The left is the old version, the right is the new version. As you can see, it is a lot cleaner, the brushes are renewed, and everything is meant to work smoothly. Here is the number 4, center housing. Keep in mind the center housing has 2 types of edges. One is flat, one is beveled. The beveled side will go towards the prop. The flat side goes towards the brush housing. Make sure that these are correct, otherwise your seals will not work and you will possibly leak water into the motor. Here are the nylon washers and the steel washer. The steel washer will go on first, and that, like as I mentioned earlier, will fall on the E-clip. The 2 nylon washers will now be installed. Those will be stacked on top of each other. Those 2 nylon washers will brush up against the end cap housing. Make sure to use some type of grease on this because you'll want to avoid squeaky sounds when you have things in use. One area I was not able to cover very well was the composite tube and the pin that you're actually supposed to drill the hole for to slide that pin. That way the cables can run through and it can lock the top head unit to be aligned with the lower end unit. This is important to make sure that when you want to go forward, the lower unit and the top head unit are matching correctly and you're going in the right direction. Now the best method that I took to this was I took a drill gun, and I don't have the exact same drill bit size to reference, but I just eyeballed the size of the bolt and tried to find the right drill bit. Also, in order to mark this in the right location, I used whiteout. I dabbed both ends of the holes when I aligned it to the lower end unit to make sure it was in the correct position. As you can see, there's a little bit of whiteout on one end and whiteout on the other end. Both areas are to give me at least an identification of where to drill the hole. Once you do that, you put your units back together and you put your prop on, you're good to go. One additional note, on the previous video that I shared on how to install the iPilot, I told you and mentioned that you should just go ahead and run the positive and negative terminal cables inside the head unit. Do not do this. Shorten the length on those properly. If you need, use a butt end connector to reconnect those. But do not do this. Inside this head unit, there's a magnetic compass. It's probably a digital compass. But long story short, that magnetic field from those polarities being drawn back and forth within that 12 volts actually prevents you from using spot lock effectively and messes up your north heading. Do not do this. I am owning up to my mistake and I apologize in advance. I will do better research on my end to make sure that you guys do not get the wrong information. On another note, I want to thank you guys for your patience and time watching this video. I hope it was helpful. And I got an upcoming video here where my buddy and I, we end up going to Paradise Point. Actually, we launched off at King Island but went in search of bass. It was a great opportunity to use the motor and get some time on the water and fish. As you can see, we did catch them, and I hope you guys stay tuned for the next one. Remember, if you like what you see, leave a like, comment, subscribe. Most importantly, share it out. I'd really help if you guys help me grow out this channel. And thank you for your time. Tight lines, everyone. Take care.